We are so excited to have with us today Dr. Giavanni Washington, affectionately known as Dr. G. She is an intuitive healer, a speaker, a spiritual guide. She has a doctorate from UCLA's Department of World Arts and Cultures, and she was recently selected for the California Creative Core Artist and Culture Bearer Fellowship by the California Arts Council. Dr. G is dedicated to amplifying Black beauty, reconnecting to the deep roots of the Black divinity, and encouraging the full expression of Black joy. Dr. G's latest creative endeavor is the Black Goddess Within Oracle deck. I have bought this deck myself. I've shared it with my friends. I've shared it with family. I absolutely love it. And we are so excited to get into this. You can follow Dr. G on TikTok and on Instagram at Black Goddess Within. Let's get to it. Everyone, we are so excited to introduce to you Dr. G and to have Dr. G on the show today. Thank you so much for joining us. We could not be more thrilled that you agreed to come on to one of our first episodes of Belonging Reimagined. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
You created a deck called the Black Goddess Within and an oracle deck that, let me tell you, when I picked this up, I'm genuinely telling you that for the first time ever in an oracle deck, and because I love tarot and oracle decks, and I work with my mediums and psychics and astrology and a lot of what I consider supports for my spiritual practice. When I saw this oracle deck for the first time, I felt myself seen in this type of tool. And incidentally, the first card that I pulled out of there was an Egyptian goddess, and I'm Egyptian. So
I love it.
it just happens that way. And I haven't told you that. I was waiting to see you again to tell you that, or we could see each other. But I just want to thank you for what you have done. And I am curious to learn from you how this deck came to be.
So there were maybe three things that happened around the same time. The first was the Ferguson debacle and Michael Brown being killed, and then a year later, the 4 policemen being acquitted. I was working with a group of Black women at that time. We were doing goddess work. There was no deck in sight. It wasn't a thought, but we were working with a goddess and goddess wisdom and energy. And I was meeting with those women on the day that the acquittal happened. And half of us were mothers. And I just remember thinking to myself, oh, this is going to be, this is going to be a hard conversation. It's going to be a doozy. And I mean, it was years ago. I can't tell you at this point what was said in the conversation, but I know that we left with a very clear call to change the way the world sees the Black body. And so for me, I mean, that's one point. There's another point. At the time, I think my kid was about 5, and something happened in kindergarten during the coloring time. And some kid told him that Black was bad. The color Black was bad. And he came home and he extrapolated that. And he said, "Oh, Mom, today, I found out that Black is bad and I'm bad because I'm Black." Right. And I was like, okay, so that's the second thing that happens. And then the third thing that happened was I ordered an Afro-Cuban tarot Orisha deck. And I was super excited. I feel like this was before Amazon Prime because it was more than 2 days. There was some time between me ordering it and me actually receiving it. And there was this anticipation, and I opened it. I'm excited. I rip off the package. I'm looking at the cards. I pull a card, and the first card I pull is Oshun, who is a goddess of love and beauty and art from the Yoruba people of Nigeria. And she's white, like the color of your chair white, and I couldn't, like glow in the dark white, right? And I was like, okay, hold up. There's some this is not okay.
I don't think this can be overstated. You pull a card that's a Nigerian goddess and they present her as white. Make it make sense.
It was, I very swiftly got rid of the deck. I think the next day the deck was gone because of the trade of enslaved Africans. Many Black folks from Nigeria were taken, and that religion traveled to Cuba, to Haiti, to Brazil, and it has become, Candomblé and Lukumi and Santeria. And Oshun is often presented as a mixed race or a lighter skinned, curly haired deity, but she was white in this deck. Like there was no mistaking. There was no African anything in her countenance. And so I was like, all right, this is it. This is the deck. And there's an irony because, I am not a visual artist at all. So it was, then became this whole other journey. Like, well, how do we bring this wisdom and these images together? That's a whole other story. But the creative process was another journey in and of itself.
I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are as to why she would be portrayed that way.
I don't know anything about this artist or the author. I suspect that they are European, maybe Eastern European from the name. I I don't know. Like it's unfathomable to me.
Mm,
Like she's not a European goddess, you know? And there's something about, I mean, there are thousands, literally, maybe even hundreds of thousands of tarot and oracle cards. And there are many, 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 like most of them, the vast majority, if they're describing or demonstrating an angel or a goddess, a deity, almost always it's a white-bodied individual.
mhm,
And so maybe they were just sort of going on with the trend. Maybe they don't actually know anything about the Orishas. Maybe it was just a production, like, oh, we just have to create something. And here's a little bit of information. There's a lot of bad information on the internet. So here's a
mm.
little, information. So we'll just go with this. Like, I have no idea. Um, I just know that it's a violence. And I felt assaulted by pulling that card.
The misrepresentation feels like an assault in itself.
Absolutely.
And the assumption I'm gonna the assumption I think here is that it's layered, right? That you have to be in a white body in order to be drawn to an oracle or tarot deck, and that um, that area of the spiritual world, in other words, is restricted to white bodies, which we know not to be true. I have a clinical mental health practice, and the vast majority of our clinicians are not in white bodies. The vast majority of our clinicians are BIPOC,
Yeah.
and um, and many of whom use oracle decks in their clinical sessions with clients as a tool to help
Hmm.
explore, the person's lived experiences. And many of their clients um, are in Black, Indigenous, and people of color bodies. And I remember being in my early 20s when I first really delved into um, exploring my spirituality. And even when I would go into, what they at the time would call new age bookstores, don't necessarily identify that way anymore. Um, there were only people in white bodies in those spaces. And I would come in generally with big curly hair or short curly hair and not see myself reflected even in the people who were in those stores. Nowadays it's very different. So, when I go into the exact same bookstore now that I was in 30 years ago, that bookstore is still there. Um, there's a vast array of ethnicities that are represented, just in shopping as customers there. So it's interesting to me that even if the assumption was that this space is occupied by white bodies only, that now that that's not true, that there still would only be, for the most part, that type of representation in these decks. And I mean, there's a huge space for the kind of work that you've done and for this Black Goddess Within deck in the spiritual world.
I mean, I've never thought about this particular deck in that way, the Afro-Cuban Orisha deck, tarot deck. Um, but it's in the tradition of subjugating people by distancing them from the deity,
Mm,
right? If God is a white male, if God is a white male, if God is a white heterosexual male, When you Google image of God, 75% of the results are white male. 75. Now, I don't know, I'm in this sort of process in my life, a moment in my life where I'm realizing how much, like, there are things that I assume that everybody knows that everyone doesn't know. So the majority of the world does not look like a white male, right? And so they've used this, and I mean, the colonial powers, the powers that we have used this structure of God as a white man to subjugate, and therefore, and the further you are away from that ideal, the more savage you are, the more animal you are, the less human you are, the more we have a right um, and a mandate to subjugate you, to make you less than, to oppress you, right? And so I didn't think of this particular deck in those terms, but I think that's absolutely what it is. It's 100% what it is, right? And I think that's why it's so interesting, because when I started this project, was it in 2016 we came up with the first deck, I definitely wasn't I was speaking of it in terms of representation, but it wasn't necessarily in terms of like combating the violence, but that's absolutely what this is. It is we need to see ourselves. I've read some studies, I think by psychologists. Anyway, he was studying religion and people who go to church, and what he found among Black and white people was that the more that they associated God as a white man, they also ascribed to white male bodies the powers of superpowers, right? Of super deity. So they're the ones who make decisions. They're the ones who are in leadership positions. They're the ones who can direct. So when you think, and it was true with Black people and with white folks. So if as a community, as a society, we're thinking that people in power should be white men, what does that say about people who have bodies like mine and yours? Like, my body's also sacred. My body also can make decisions. My body's also sovereign unto itself, right? And all of that gets washed away when you insist that the supreme being, the supreme divine being is a white male body.
It gets transferred into other areas of our lives.
100%.
It gets projected into other areas of our lives. And then we ourselves internalize that messaging that we do not have a certain kind of power of ourselves. And what you were describing earlier, too, it's this in terms of exclusion is what I was hearing. There's a violence around that exclusivity, specifically in saying that you have to follow these kinds of rules in order to belong in this space. And if you don't, then we are going to commit some kind of violence upon you. And that violence can take many different forms. And
100%.
one of the greatest forms outside of physical violence is, I think, a really nuanced one, which is what this podcast is about, is belonging. So when we exclude you, that means you do not belong. And across the different, the 4 different types of belonging that I've identified, you don't belong to yourself. That's that sovereignty you're talking about. You don't have agency over your own voice.
Yeah.
We're going to exclude you from bigger systems in terms of not seeing yourself represented. I think that's the universal belonging. You're kicked out of that. There you go. We're going to kick you out of this community in some way, even if you're physically showing up to it. We're going to make it known that you're not one of us. And then even in interpersonal relationships, it's we're going to make sure that you don't have a mentor, for example. We're not going to set you up for success. We're not going to groom you for leadership positions. There's so many different life spaces in which that underlying belief that there's this white, straight, cisgender male God impacts the way that we see the world and see ourselves and our positions in it. That's what I'm hearing from you.
I learned this great acronym the other day. OBOT, like only black one there. That was really hilarious. But I can't tell you how many times I've been the OBOT in a spiritual space and ended up having to defend my Blackness or explain my Blackness or account for my Blackness in a place where I thought like race, and it's happened on several occasions where I feel I just walk into this naive thing. I become this naive person, forgetting that my body has significations, right? And I'm just a person, and I'm a spiritual being in this room. It's like, no, you're a Black person in this room, and we're not. And even in all of our our goodness and well intentions, we're gonna not let you forget that you were a Black person in this space, right? And it's
Mhm.
like if I don't belong there, where can I belong? If I don't belong in the place where where the intentions are the best, like where am I safe?
Where are Black bodies safe? I think is
Yeah,
the question that has come up over and over and over again, particularly in these last few years, as far as
absolutely.
mainstream. It's been a question that's been there for a long time. But as far as now, who's beginning to ask that question more and more, um, you know, like you said, even in the most well-intentioned space. And what I'm also curious about, Dr. G, is within the Black community, how is that experience in terms of your spirituality?
Well, that's a really great question. Because I think that the isolation or the alienation also happens in Black spaces. Like if you're not down for white Jesus, then people look at you sideways. You get the side eye.
Mhm.
I do find as I've gotten older, I mean, I left the Christian church when I was 16. I was like, I have too many questions and there's too much hypocrisy and no one's answering my questions. Um, and I mean, I guess to just take a step back, my mother was Catholic, my father was Baptist, and we were raised Methodist because they couldn't stand each other's churches. So, which I think is hilarious. But at 16, I left the United Methodist Church and, started my own spiritual explorations and reading, different philosophies or theologies. And when I come back around with my questions or my findings or my other ways of being in relation with God, to the sort of traditional Christian Black folks, they look at me crazy. They're like, this is the work of the devil. What are you talking about?" And so it's like you're sort of in a bind. You're not safe in the spaces where you're the minority, but you're also not accepted in the spaces where you are the majority, but your thinking is different. Right.
But
And so it's you
you're the minority in terms of your view on spirituality.
right. I'm not the racial minority, but I'm the I guess the spiritual minority. And I've had some interesting conversations about this oracle deck with some. I feel like when I first talk about it, if people don't have a familiarity, if like a traditional Christian Black person doesn't have a familiarity with oracle and tarot decks, or they've just heard about it, they're like, "Oh, that's idolatry. This is not for me." And then when I show it to them, like something happens. And it's not that they're going to become rabid oracle deck, users, but they see what's happening in the deck and they see their mothers, their sisters, their aunties, their children who are being lifted up in a way that it's just not of the devil. I mean, I know this is not like a religious thing, but it's there's nothing evil about it, right? It's just
Mhm.
another way of seeing. The Bible's full of stories, and this deck is just it's full of stories. It's mythology, right? It's full of stories. It's full of wisdom and different perspectives. And when people use these stories to make sense of the world, right? And I think that when in particularly the Black community who is not familiar with who I would call more religious versus spiritual. Um, well, that's a maybe pernicious distinction, but um, people who are more traditionally Christian than not, they I've found a lot of acceptance. I'll be honest. I have found more. There's initial resistance, and then when they actually get the cards in their hands and look at it and understand what's happening, they see like I'm not trying to convert anybody. I'm not proselytizing. I am proselytizing about representation, but I'm not proselytizing about these particular traditions, right? I'm not trying to make you whatever. I'm trying to heal the wounds of colonialism and us stitch when I talk about like the middle passage or the wounds of colonialism, I literally visualize what I see is these two pieces of ribbon that have been shredded and a thin gold thread that's weaving them back together. And I think that's what this deck is doing. That's what these images are doing. That's what working with these women who are in the deck. Like these are not models. These are real people, right? Who have real lives and real experiences. And they're bringing all of that into this relationship with this goddess and this mythologies from different places in Africa.
When I first held the deck in my hands, I there's an energy to it. I mean, even as you were talking about it, I get goosebumps. I immediately got these goosebumps coming up me, even just now talking about it. there is a certain energy that feels expansive, that
Mm,
feels, um, there's a source energy that comes through it. And it's interesting because I've spoken with so many people in the past who don't understand the difference between religiosity and spirituality,
mhm.
where religiosity is the level to which you identify with the indoctrination or the doctrine of a specific religion. Spirituality is the degree to which someone feels a connection with their own values that may be informed by some kind of source energy or some kind of you know connection um, to a force that feels greater to them in some way. You can be a deeply spiritual person without being a religious person. And you can also be a religious and spiritual person at the same time. And so when you're talking about showing this oracle deck, this very special oracle deck to people who are maybe really very strongly identify as Christian, it seems like what I'm hearing, Dr. G, is that you're introducing to them the concept of expanding or maybe even using this as a tool to what their already
Yeah,
religious beliefs might be telling them. And that it's not necessarily this kind of broad stroke of like what I hear often is, be careful of false prophets. That
right,
it's not necessarily a
right,
false prophet. It's stories in there where people might see themselves reflected and can give them a pause button to explore that particular aspect of their own lives, as well as um, connect with you know, what what I've heard you talk about before, like ancestral healing. This deck isn't just for people in Black bodies. I mean,
yeah,
the same way that people of color, people who are Black, people who are Indigenous can see certain aspects of themselves, whether it's values in um, in white bodies, in values or in messaging that comes from white bodies. You don't have to be in a Black body in order to receive messaging here that could be useful and helpful. And the idea, I'm going to be really bold and say this, the idea um, that this is only for Black bodies, I find to be, if anyone who is not in a Black body who believes that, it's quite arrogant, quite frankly, that you can only see yourself reflected in somebody who looks exactly like you.
it's a point of privilege, right?
Right.
I did a live somewhere, and one of the comments was they thought the podcast or whatever it was, the live was gonna be about, the dark goddess, 'cause there's this whole, the dark goddess archetype, and when they realized that it was actually goddesses from Africa, the comment was, "Oh, well, it doesn't matter, it shouldn't matter because isn't spirituality about the spirit? It's not about our bodies?" The fact that you're making this comment underscores my point that we need this deck in the world because, and it's again not, I say it, what we say over here in the Black Goddess universe is the deck is for everybody in everybody,
Mhm.
right? So I think that this changing the way the world sees a Black body, it's not purely or only just a Black person's effort. Like we all have to change the way that we're thinking about this, right? And so I also think it changes the way we think about Africa. I think first of all, we think of Africa as a point, right? A lot of people, it's a country. It's like, oh my God, if I hear one more person say that Africa's a country.
The most
Um,
diverse continent in the world.
and even, it's interesting, you're from Egypt. A lot of people don't think of North Africa as Africa, right? North Africa is like this other place.
I love that you said that because I did not expect that North Africa was going to be, I just didn't want to make the assumption that North Africa was going to be represented in this deck. It's my own thing, okay? And so it was interesting that the very first card that I pulled out of how many cards?
44.
44, one of my favorite numbers, that pulling that first card when I saw myself, it was such, I had tears come up in my eyes
Mm,
because I think of myself as African, but I also recognize that I'm a medium brown skin, that there's certain privileges that I've had that I'm not in a Black body, that I'm in a brown body, I'm in an Egyptian body. And um, and while there are challenges there, the experiences are different. And so when I pulled that card, I want to thank you again, because it was a reminder to me that I am part of this beautiful, rich, incredibly diverse culture and cultures, and that I am a part of that. And for someone who, like myself, who has not easily found belonging
Yeah.
in many life spaces, and most of the life spaces, I've had to create it for myself and
Hmm.
successfully have done that. But it took a concerted effort. There
Yeah.
weren't necessarily spaces that were sitting there wide open for me. I felt a sense of universal and ancestral belonging, which I think is really
Ashe.
sits in all the different types of belongings. I don't think it's necessarily a separate one itself. I think it's an interweaving of the different types of belonging. I felt that instantly, instantly.
Mm.
And I just want to tell you that, because I really hope that you hear that. And I hope that other people hear that, because I have a white husband who picked up this deck and felt not necessarily the same thing, but also felt some kind of spark. And the word expansion is what comes to mind. And I think
Ashe.
expansion is really what this deck is all about, expanding the way, just to reiterate, you were saying, expanding the way that we see Black bodies, expanding the way that we conceptualize even ourselves, expanding the assumptions that we have made that we might not be aware of, expanding our awareness around our assumptions, and all of that in this beautiful deck that you have created. And I know you had a team of people that did that. And I really love this story. If you would uh, do the honors of sharing the story of how these beautiful spirits came together to create this deck that you had touched on
Mm.
earlier.
Every day I get to see, a new goddess, a new face, and I'm reminded of this time that we had together. We did the process twice, once for the first deck. It was very quick the first time. It was like 3 days. Um, and then the second time for this deck that just came out a few months ago, the process was like 3 months, and we spent time together doing personal development, deep spiritual excavation, really trying to identify the goddess qualities inside ourselves and trying to understand how we can wield this ancient knowledge in our contemporary lives. Um, and we got to know goddesses from Africa. And then at some point, there was a process of alignment where um, it's hard to say they chose, but I feel like sometimes the goddesses chose the woman, we use the verb meet. The program was called Meet the Goddess Within, Across the Threshold. And because they're not portraying, they're not demonstrating, because they're not modeling, they literally are embodying the energy and the spirit and the stories of these goddesses.
These
And
are your
so
friends that you're talking about.
some of them are my friends. Some of them were people. I mean, they're all people that I love.
Mm.
I didn't necessarily always have a relationship with them beforehand. Um, but certainly now we all have this, like this sister goddesshood. I don't even know what to call it. Um, but we worked together online for 3 months, and then we came together in person because people came from all over the country. And we had a weekend together with, a dinner, a ritual, some ceremony, the photo shoot. And they literally crossed the threshold. They stepped into something. So it wasn't just about the picture or the deck. It was about them wielding this goddess wisdom in a new way in their lives. They're going to walk into the world in a different way. And they claimed it in this ritual. They claimed it out loud. It
Mhm.
was witnessed in community, which I'm really, really big on. And yeah, that's like the short version of the process. It was at one point for this second deck, I thought, this would be so much easier if I just got models, right? And I could just pay people to do the thing. And I think it was in my heart, I knew that wasn't going to fly. Like we needed the heart wisdom of these women to bring these goddesses to life. To bring them to life in this deck. And this is an interesting deck in that, we talked about the diversity of Africa. these goddesses are from all over the continent. So it's not an Orisha deck. It's not an Ateru deck. It's not the Egyptian gods and goddesses. It has goddesses from about 20, maybe 24 different cultures, right? Which is still not, it doesn't represent every single culture in Africa, but many more. It's a large swath. We have from, East, North, West, South Africa. And which I think is really important for me and for the majority of the women in this deck, if not all of them. We are all diasporic Black women.
What does ancestral healing mean for you?
I tend to use the phrase ancestral restoration.
Mm.
Um, but I think at base, at least for me, it's about filling in the holes in our story, right? For me, the biggest sort of grief that I carry, or I was going to say wound, but grief that I carry is the loss of the stories in the Middle Passage. So in the
Mm.
transatlantic trade of enslaved African, the estimates between 5 million and 20 million people were lost. Many Africans and indigenous folks too, on this shore were died and buried without ceremony. It's like all of those all of that knowledge and wisdom that was buried with those people. That's, I think, one of the griefs that sits really heavy on me. And so if I can unearth some of that wisdom, if I can find out stories about my, immediate ancestors, but also my long ago ancestors, that to me is the healing. It's the information and the wisdom that will keep me out of my negative cycles.
Mm.
This is the ancestral healing.
The stories, and that
Mhm.
really that hits hard because I've heard so many people say, "Oh, how wonderful that now being African American, you can," and they'll say specifically African American, "you can now go and get the DNA testing and find out what your lineage is." Okay, and the stories are lost. I mean, that is such a key component.
I've done African ancestry.com, and they traced my father's line to a particular people in Burkina Faso. And that did something for me. Like a layer stood up and was like, they've been recognized and they've been called forward. And like, I stand straighter now having that particular piece of information. There's a it's belonging. There's a piece of me
Yeah.
that belongs to something.
That's exactly where my mind went to, is like that gap, that belonging gap has started to fill. It starts to fill. It starts to at least be shaded in some.
Yeah.
Not necessarily rich in hue yet, but it starts to get filled in.
Well, what's interesting about it is that in 2006 and 7, I went to Burkina Faso. Um, the first time for like an 11-day drum and dance camp. And the second time I went back for 7 weeks. I spent 7 weeks in Burkina Faso. And then a few years ago, I ended up studying a divination technique with Malidoma Somé, who was also from Burkina Faso. And all of that happened before I figured out that I was from Burkina Faso. So it's like it's been calling to me all this time, right? And I've been heeding the call, and I was like, oh, I wasn't making this up. Like this is not just a curiosity. There was something that was really pulling me there, and so there is definitely. I mean, I feel like all of this work and my whole life, even all of my academic search, it's all been about. I heard someone say once, "Research is me search." Um,
So
it's all
true. So
is it
true.
interesting? Like, I'm trying to
Ah,
figure out these holes. I'm trying to put these holes together. They do that assignment, I think, in maybe elementary school where you have to do your family tree, and that was heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. I can tell you who my great-grandparents were, and then and other people were going back, "Oh, I'm related to King Leopold," or "I'm related to this," and I'm just like, "This is not fair." But as a 4th grader, like, what words do you have really, right? But I think since then, I've been like, I need to figure out who my people are and what their stories are, and I've come to find out that on my dad's side in Texas, they didn't just work the land, because yes, they did work the land as enslaved people, but at post emancipation, they own land. And one of them was a mayor and somebody was a veterinarian, and they had a stream that ran through the land that they owned. And they gave away the bounty from their fruit trees. Like they shared with neighbors. They had a relationship with the land, and as a
mm,
person who lives in a big city, I feel very disconnected from the land, but to know that that's in my lineage, to know that we had a relationship with the land, it changes the way I feel about, my grass outside. It changes the
It
way
looks different.
I'm like, oh wait, this is not just, I don't own this. I'm a steward here.
Mhm.
And that changes my relationship. It means that we belong. Well, this is my new thing. Like, we belong to each other.
We do belong to each other, and I think that's part of that universal belonging of,
Mm.
I do belong in this world. This is this space that is occupied by me and other people. I belong in it. I belong in this small space. I belong in this big space. And when I rewind back to what you're saying about that that little girl in school
Mhm.
and only being able to go back so far and not having the words to explain that sensation of I can only identify back to my great grandparents. I know that I have, in talking with when folks who, in doing genograms, for example, as far as similar idea, exploring, ancestry, and exploring family dynamics. And they say, "Oh, I was adopted," or "My parents were adopted," or my one parent was adopted, or "My grandparents passed young." Or there are different stories there. They don't know their lineage. Anytime they have to do that kind of assignment, there's a certain shame that comes with that in looking around that other people, and you're nodding your head. I feel it's like this is resonating. Other people are, able to just, go have a conversation or call up their grandparent or ask their parents about it, or somewhere or another this is recorded. And then you're not able to do that. I wonder how much of that shame how much of an undercurrent of shame people carry with them throughout their lives that's associated with, I don't know exactly how I got here. I don't
Yeah.
know the stories that brought me to life over time, um, beyond, um, if we're lucky, right, maybe one or two or possibly three generations. Final question
Yes.
that I ask everyone:
Okay.
what does belonging mean to you?
Like, I feel like we know belonging when we have it, right? And you said, yeah, it's about being, I think you said, seen, embraced, and celebrated. And
Yes.
that's really been resonating with me. And I do think it's about being accepted and held, um, without shame on either side of that relationship.
And I love that so much. I love to hear people's different conceptualizations of what belonging is. And there's that common thread, I think, throughout of just this deep acceptance. And I know
Mhm.
you and I had talked about before in terms of spirituality that oftentimes, uh, as well, let's just say this, we live in a really dense world. The energy here is heavy, the energy here
Mm.
is dense. It's a oftentimes, not in all the spaces, but oftentimes a low frequency
Mhm.
world that we're in, which is why I stay away from the news as much as I can, which is a luxury. But I have to do that to a large extent in order to maintain the frequency I'm trying to stay on. I'm trying to ride this wave, Dr. G. And oftentimes, as we continue to move through our spiritual development and our spiritual journey, particularly when we're doing it with intention, and when we're doing it in a place that's rooted in love and respect and expansion, we can start to feel more and more and more disconnected from this world,
Mm.
from the denseness of this world that we're in. It's important, I think, for those of us who are on this personal development journey, which is a lot of people, by the way, that we connect in some way, that we build community, that we find one another, because we're going to be expelled from certain communities that are still operating on a certain vibration.
Yeah.
And one of the things that this deck has done is that I have found other people who are also using it. And I've been
Ashe.
able to create community and connect with other people and be able to talk about it. And of course, it leads to so many different conversations outside of this deck that, again, I think it serves the purpose of what it's meant to do, which is to spark conversation, spark awareness, and expand our sense of self. And for that, I really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much
wonderful.
for being
Thank you so
with
much.
us. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you
Much
for having me.
love to you, Dr.
Delightful.
G.
All right.